The moment I saw her flashlight cutting through the darkness outside my garage, my blood ran cold. There she stood, Melissa Garrett, the Riverside Heights HOA, president crawling across my snow-covered driveway like a thief in the night. On my security monitor, her shadowy figure moved toward the storage shed, completely unaware that every step she took was being recorded in crystal clear 1080p. What she was about to do would destroy her career. What she didn't know was that I'd been waiting for this exact moment for 8 months. You think you can just walk in here and take whatever you want? She'd screamed at me during our last confrontation, her face twisted with rage. That was before she knew I had her on camera. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to explain how an ordinary Tuesday in November became the night that changed everything. My name is Marcus Sullivan, 45 years old, and I make my living as a forensic accountant. 17 years of tracking financial inconsistencies taught me patience. Document everything. Never move until you have ironclad evidence. Watch. Wait. Record. That discipline served me well in court. It would serve me even better against Melissa Garrett. I inherited the Riverside Heights property from my father 18 months ago, a beautiful colonial on 5. 2 acres of Connecticut woodland, sitting just outside the official HOA boundary by a technicality that would become very important later. The house predated the Riverside Heights HOA by 6 years. According to county records and property surveys filed in 1987, my land existed in a grandfathered status, technically within the neighborhood, but exempt from HOA jurisdiction. Most people would have left it at that. Not Melissa. 3 weeks after I moved in, she knocked on my door with a clipboard and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was tall, blonde, professionally dressed, exactly the type who'd spent her life getting what she wanted through confidence and corporate speak. She handed me a printed list of 23 violations requiring immediate correction. The paint color, the fence height, the rustic mailbox my father had built 40 years ago, the storage shed my grandfather had constructed in 1962. Everything about my property seemed to personally offend her sense of order. I read the violations twice while she waited. Then I explained politely that according to county records, my land fell outside HOA jurisdiction. I wasn't subject to her rules. Her jaw clenched. That was the first sign of what was coming. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Preston and Associates, the law firm representing the HOA. It demanded I achieve compliance immediately with HOA standards. The language was professionally threatening. Failure to comply may result in liens and legal action. They wanted my shed relocated. They wanted my house repainted. They wanted my property to fit their vision. I spent 8 hours drafting a response. 8 pages of precedent-setting law, Colorado property statutes, and grandfathering clauses. I attached building permits from 1962, survey documents, and boundary records proving my land's exemption status. I sent copies to the law firm, the county assessor, and Melissa personally. Then came 6 weeks of silence. I thought the matter was settled. I should have known better. Melissa hadn't remained HOA president for 9 years by accepting defeat. If law wouldn't give her power over my property, she'd find another way. She went digital. A Facebook group called Preserve Riverside Heights Standards appeared online. Melissa created it, moderated it, seeded it with photos of my house taken from the street, captioned with words like blight, declining values, and community drag. My house wasn't neglected. The paint was original but well maintained. My yard was clean. Everything functioned properly. But Melissa had learned that narrative mattered more than truth. She positioned herself as the reasonable voice, protecting everyone's investments while I became the irresponsible outsider bringing down the neighborhood. Some neighbors joined her crusade. Others pushed back, demanding actual evidence. The group fractured into two camps, and Melissa expertly positioned herself as the voice of reason caught between extremists on both sides. I documented everything. Screenshots with timestamps. Filed them methodically. My lawyer said we had clear defamation grounds. But I wanted to see how far she'd push first. The monthly HOA meeting in October gave me my answer. Melissa proposed a special motion to expand HOA jurisdiction to include historically excluded properties. She never mentioned my name. She just kept referencing how inconsistent standards affected community property values and how bringing all properties into unified governance would strengthen everyone's investment. 42 residents attended. I sat in the back. Melissa's presentation was impressive, professionally produced slides. Carefully scripted talking points. Graphs showing similar neighborhoods and their unified aesthetic standards. 15 minutes of calculated persuasion designed to make expansion seem inevitable and reasonable. When she finished, the HOA board opened the floor for discussion. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't attack her personally. I simply presented facts. Property maps, state law. Specific statutes about retroactive jurisdiction expansion and HOA authority limitations. I explained, point by point, how her proposal was legally impossible and how attempting it would expose the HOA to significant liability. I spoke for exactly 12 minutes. When I finished, the room was completely silent. The vote came quickly. 31 inches favor of my position. 94 against Melissa's proposal. The board chair thanked everyone and moved to the next agenda item. Melissa gathered her materials with shaking hands and left before adjournment. I watched her go. Something about her exit told me this wasn't over. I was right. I walked to my truck in the parking lot to find her waiting beside my driver's door. Her professional mask had completely slipped. Up close, I could see something harder underneath, something darker. "I know you think you're smart," she said, stepping closer. "I know you think you've won, but I'm going to find something you're violating. I don't care if I have to do it myself. I'm going to find evidence." I looked at her with complete calm and said, "Trespassing on private property is a criminal offense. Melissa, I'd think about that before following through on threats." She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound, and walked away. That night, driving home through October rain, I made a decision. Melissa had just told me exactly what she planned to do. She'd escalate. She'd trespass. She'd try to gather evidence she could use against me. The next morning, I called a security company and upgraded my system. 2 additional cameras with night vision. Motion sensors. Remote monitoring. Cloud backup to 3 separate servers. The technician said it was excessive for a rural property. I said I preferred excessive to regretful. 3 weeks later, I had a professional-grade electronic lock installed on the storage shed's main door, the kind that logged every access attempt and could be controlled from my phone. I told the locksmith it was for peace of mind. I was really laying a trap. December 8th arrived cold and dark. Weather reports called it the worst winter storm in 17 years. By late afternoon at 5, snow was falling so thick I could barely see the tree line. Wind rattled my windows hard enough to rattle the frames. Emergency broadcasts urged people to stay off the roads. Conditions were perfect for someone to think they could commit a crime without being caught. I was in my home office when the motion sensor triggered at 6:15 in the evening. The camera showed a figure moving through the storm toward my storage shed. Low, careful movements. This wasn't someone lost. This was someone who knew exactly where they were going and didn't want to be seen. I didn't panic. I just watched. The figure reached the shed at 6:23. Even through the degraded video quality, I could see deliberate intent. They knelt by the door, hands, working with purpose. Picking the old mechanical lock, the original hardware my grandfather had installed decades ago. That lock was mostly decorative, worn and weak. It wouldn't stop anyone determined. I set down my coffee and opened my phone. The storage shed app showed everything. Locked, full battery, undisturbed. I had control options. I could unlock it remotely, change the access code, or activate override mode, the one that disabled all mechanisms until I manually reset them. I stared at that last option for a long moment, thinking through what would happen next. Then I put the phone down. Not yet. Let her commit fully. The best traps don't spring until the prey is completely invested. At 6:24, the outer door gave way. The figure grabbed their backpack and slipped inside. I heard the door close with a metallic click. That's when I smiled. The outer door had a self-locking bolt designed to engage automatically when closed from inside. My grandfather had installed it during the Cold War for emergency shelter. Now it served a different purpose entirely. The person in my storage shed was now locked inside a climate-controlled concrete structure with only one exit, an electronic door they couldn't possibly open, in a space that blocked all cell signals. They'd trapped themselves without even realizing it. I waited exactly 7 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and navigated to my contacts. I found the county sheriff's non-emergency number saved just in case, right next to my lawyer's cell. But I didn't call yet. First, I wanted to gather every frame of evidence. Everything had to be absolutely airtight. I opened my laptop and began logging observations. 6:26. Subject enters storage, shed. Closes self-locking door behind self. 6:28. Subject attempts to manipulate outer door handle. No success. Self-locking mechanism engaged. 6:31. Subject examines electronic keypad lock. Attempting to work it. 6:33. Subject tries codes. First attempt, 1, 2, 3, 4. Second attempt, 0, 0, 0, 0. Third attempt, 1, 9, 8, 7. I almost laughed. Even while breaking into my property. She'd tried the year the HOA was founded. Her obsession with that organization was total. Complete. It consumed her. The fifth failed attempt triggered the lock's security protocol. The app sent a notification with a sound that made me sit forward. 10-minute lockout engaged. The electronic keypad went dark red, a warning that must have looked like a death sentence to her. I watched her step back on the camera feed, probably seeing that warning light for the first time. Probably finally understanding that her plan wasn't just failing, it was catastrophically, irreversibly failing. In her desperation to gather evidence against me, she'd walked directly into the kind of trap that separates the strategic from the stupid. And I was going to document every second of it. The wind outside intensified. Snow piled higher against my windows with a sound like someone throwing fistfuls of ice at the glass. Power flickered but held. Perfect storm weather. The kind that creates ideal conditions for crime and equally ideal conditions for a criminal to realize she's made the worst mistake of her life. I zoomed in as far as the camera allowed. The figure sat down on the steps leading to the interior door, back against the metal frame. The hood fell back slightly, revealing blonde hair. No question now. It was Melissa Garrett, the HOA president herself, locked in my storage shed, trapped by her own choices and her own desperation to prove she controlled something that wasn't hers to control. I should have felt triumphant. 8 months of harassment. threatening letters, social media attacks, lies told to neighbors about my property. All of it leading to this moment where she'd finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But triumph wasn't what I felt. Mostly, I felt tired. At 7:20, I made my decision. I activated the intercom system I'd installed 3 months earlier, originally for emergencies, in case I ever needed help while working in the shed. The speaker sat in the ceiling near the camera, small and unobtrusive, carefully positioned so that from her angle in that concrete box, she'd never see it coming. She had no idea her voice could be heard outside. No idea that her frantic attempts to escape, her panicked breathing, all of it had been amplifying through my audio monitors. I unmuted my microphone and spoke, keeping my voice level and calm, the same tone I'd used when breaking down her legal arguments at the HOA meeting. The same tone I'd use if she ever decided to listen to reason. "Melissa," I said. On the monitor. She jumped like she'd been electrocuted. Her flashlight clattered to the floor with a metallic sound that echoed through the storage shed. Her head whipped around in 3 desperate directions, trying to locate the source of my voice, trying to understand how I could possibly know where she was, what she'd done, who she was. I waited for her breath to slow, watching her visible panic. Then I continued. "I've been watching you since you entered my property. I have video of you breaking the outer lock. I have access logs from every failed attempt on the electronic system. You're currently trespassing on private land and attempting to burgle a secured structure." Her response came fast. Voice echoing in the concrete space. "Open this door immediately. You've set a trap. This is illegal imprisonment." I listened without interrupting. Let her spend her anger against the walls. When she finished, I replied with facts. "I didn't trap you, Melissa. You trapped yourself by entering my property without permission and closing a self-locking door behind you. I didn't imprison you. I simply declined to assist someone actively committing crimes against me. And I will open the door as soon as law enforcement arrives to document your actions." Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then she tried a different approach. Her voice softened, became almost apologetic. "This is all a misunderstanding. I just wanted to check on something. We can work this out privately. There's no need to involve law enforcement." This was exactly how she'd operated for 8 months. Aggressive until confronted. Then, immediately pivoting to reasonable explanations. Trying to avoid consequences by reframing criminal behavior as simple miscommunication. I told her no. No private negotiations. No working it out. No pretending this was anything other than what it was. "You told me you'd find evidence against me by any means necessary," I said. "You followed through. And you'll face exactly the consequences that threat deserved." She started yelling again, but I muted the intercom. I'd said what needed to be said. Now came the waiting. I sent a text to my lawyer. "Situation developing. Need you on standby. Will call within the hour." He replied instantly, "Standing by. Don't do anything without me on the line." Good advice. Desmond had kept me out of trouble for 3 years with his philosophy: patience over reaction, documentation over confrontation, legal process over emotional response. Tonight would vindicate every cautious decision we'd made. At 7:40, I unmuted the intercom again and told Melissa I was calling the county sheriff to report trespassing in progress. She could cooperate when they arrived or make things harder for herself. Her choice entirely. Then I dialed. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. Professional and calm. Despite the storm chaos she was clearly managing, I identified myself, gave my address, explained the situation in clear, Factual terms. Someone had broken into my property storage structure and was currently unable to exit. I had video evidence. The individual wasn't injured, but couldn't leave without my assistance. I was requesting an officer to document the situation before I released her. The dispatcher asked if the person posed any danger. I said no. Asked if I felt threatened. I said no. Asked if I could maintain the current situation. I said absolutely. She told me response time would be 45 minutes to an hour given weather conditions. I said I'd wait. Official record. No going back now. I turned back to my monitor. The figure in the shed had stopped moving, just sitting there in the cold darkness. Finally understanding that some lines once crossed change everything. The emotional stages unfolded exactly as I'd expected. First came denial pacing the small shed, testing both doors repeatedly as if the locks might magically disengage. Then anger shouting at the ceiling. At the camera she still hadn't located. Then bargaining, her voice going soft and reasonable through the intercom I'd muted. Now, finally, something closer to acceptance. She sat motionless on the steps, conserving body heat, waiting. At 7 minutes past 8, dispatch called back. An officer was en route. Estimated arrival in 30 minutes. I watched the camera feed one more time before settling in to wait. In the shed, I could see items scattered around Melissa's feet. A small digital camera, a notepad and pen, a measuring tape, the crowbar she'd used to break the lock. She'd come prepared. She'd planned to document whatever she could find, manufacture violations if necessary, then present her evidence at the next board meeting. Her entire plan was transparent in hindsight. Break in during the storm. Document whatever she could find or fabricate. Return home undetected. Build her case for why she needed authority over my property. Except she'd miscalculated on every single point. She didn't know I'd been watching since the moment she stepped onto my land. Didn't know the shed contained only legitimate storage seed collections, gardening equipment, old furniture. Didn't know the doors would trap her. Definitely didn't know I'd prioritize legal process over her comfort. Her entire plan depended on me being either oblivious or passive. She'd spent 8 months watching me respond to her provocations with patience and documentation. And somehow she'd interpreted that patience as weakness rather than strategy. That misreading was about to cost her everything. The deputy's vehicle appeared in my driveway at 8:35, headlights cutting through the storm. I stood and grabbed my coat, then paused to make sure I had everything organized, video files queued and ready. Lock system logs downloaded and saved. Timeline documented. Everything accessible and undeniable. Then I headed downstairs. The deputy was tall, early 50s, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd worked too many winter emergency calls. I recognized him immediately. Same officer who'd responded to a noise complaint 6 months ago. We'd spoken briefly. He recognized me too, nodding as he approached. We shook hands on the porch. I thanked him for coming out in this weather. He said it was the job. I laid out the situation chronologically and factually. Suspicious activity on security cameras. At 6:15, observed an individual approaching my storage shed with tools. Watched them break the mechanical lock and enter. Explained the self-locking mechanism and the electronic lock system. Described how the individual became trapped. Made verbal contact via intercom. Called sheriff's office before releasing her. The deputy took notes, asking clarifying questions. How long had she been trapped? About 2 hours. Was she injured? Not to my knowledge. Did I know who she was? Yes. Did I want to press charges? Absolutely. I showed him the video footage on my phone. Her approach through the storm? Kneeling at the door with tools. Forcing the lock. Entering the corridor. Closing the door. Attempting codes on the electronic system. Everything clear. Time-stamped. Undeniable. He watched without expression, then asked to see the full recording. I said everything was saved on my computer inside, along with system logs showing exactly when each lock engaged and every failed access attempt. He asked where the structure was located. I led him around the house, both of us trudging through snow that was already 8 inches deep and still falling. The shed entrance sat at the base of a slope, barely visible under accumulated drift. The deputy swept his flashlight across the damaged lock mechanism hanging loose where she'd forced it open. He knelt down, studying the tool marks, the bent metal. Straightforward, breaking and entering. He stood and brushed snow off his knees, then asked if I was certain I wanted to proceed with charges. I looked at him directly. I warned her a month ago that trespassing was a criminal offense. She did it anyway. Actions have consequences. He made a radio call requesting backup and medical response. Dispatch confirmed both were en route in about 20 minutes. We walked back to my house to wait. In my office, I showed him the full security system setup, multiple camera angles, cloud backup, detailed logs. He reviewed everything methodically, occasionally making notes. When he finished, he asked how long I'd had this level of surveillance. I explained the timeline. The escalating conflict with Melissa. Her explicit threat to find evidence against me personally. My decision to document everything. He asked if the person in my shed was the HOA president. I confirmed it was. The deputy sat back, rubbing his jaw. He said this would create significant community tension. I said the community deserved to know their president was willing to commit crimes to maintain power. He didn't disagree. When the backup unit and medical response arrived, we all headed to the shed. The deputy briefed them quickly. Individual trapped inside approximately 2 hours. Not injured. Possibly uncomfortable. Situation is criminal trespass. One paramedic asked if we were sure about her condition. I held up my phone and showed the live camera feed. She was sitting upright, moving normally. No signs of distress beyond anger and cold. The deputy positioned himself at the door, hand near his belt. His partner stood to the side with a camera to document the extraction. The paramedics readied their equipment. Everyone looked at me. I opened the lock app, navigated to override controls, and disabled the manual lock mode. The electronic system beeped once. Then I selected unlock. The mechanism clicked loud in the quiet storm. The deputy pulled the inner door open. Melissa came out fast, pushing past the deputy, stumbling in the snow. For a moment, I thought she might run. Then she saw the uniforms, the vehicles, the official response, and stopped. Her face went from rage to confusion to something approaching horror. The first deputy held up his hand and identified himself. He advised her of her rights, the full Miranda warning delivered in a flat, professional tone, while snow fell around us and my security cameras recorded everything. This wasn't negotiable anymore. This wasn't a private dispute. This was law enforcement conducting a criminal investigation, and she was the suspect. A paramedic approached with a thermal blanket. She took it automatically, wrapping it around her shoulders while the deputy continued explaining her rights. She wasn't listening. She was staring at me, standing 10 feet away next to the shed door. I held her gaze. Expression neutral. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked back at her the same way I'd looked at her in the parking lot when I said trespassing was a crime. Calm. factual, unmoved. She'd had every opportunity to stop escalating. She'd chosen this path decision by decision. Now she stood in my yard, surrounded by police, wrapped in an emergency blanket, about to be charged with felonies. And I felt nothing but the cold certainty that justice, real justice, doesn't require emotion. It just requires patience, evidence, and letting people face the natural consequences of their own actions. The deputy began photographing the scene while his partner continued processing her rights. I watched from my position near the shed, hands in my coat pockets, breathing steady clouds of vapor into the cold air. She'd stopped trying to speak. Mascara streaked down her cheeks from tears and melted snow. I recognized that look, disbelief mixing with rage. The expression of someone realizing they'd miscalculated so badly that the damage couldn't be undone. The deputy asked if she understood her rights. She nodded once. Asked if she was willing to answer questions. She opened her mouth, closed it, then said she wanted a lawyer. Smart move. Probably the first smart decision she'd made all night. The deputy and his partner exchanged brief words I couldn't hear over the wind. Then the lead deputy approached me, notepad ready. He needed my formal statement for the report. I gave it chronologically and without embellishment. Observed suspicious activity. Watched it develop into clear criminal trespass. Documented everything. Called for official response. He asked if I wanted to provide the video files now or later. I said now. I'd already prepared copies on a thumb drive I'd labeled with dates and timestamps. The transfer completed. I handed him the drive along with printed logs from the electronic lock system. He reviewed the printout briefly, then looked up at me. He said most people would have just opened the door and sent her away. I said most people weren't dealing with 8 months of systematic harassment and explicit threats to trespass. He made a call on his radio. His partner requested assistance with transport. The deputy acknowledged and we prepared for the final extraction. Melissa was loaded into the patrol vehicle. The paramedics cleared her medically, no signs of hypothermia. Only minor abrasions on her hands from working the locks. The deputies explained what came next. Given the clear documentation and circumstances, they'd be charging her with criminal trespass in the first degree and criminal mischief. She'd be transported to the county detention center for booking. She'd already invoked her right to counsel. So, no further questioning tonight. I asked about bail. The deputy said it would be set at her arraignment, probably within 48 hours. I asked about a restraining order. He said I could file for that separately through the county clerk, and given the documented pattern of harassment, it would likely be granted. Then both vehicles pulled away slowly, tires crunching through fresh snow, red and blue lights fading into the storm. I stood in my driveway, watching until the lights disappeared completely. Then I turned and walked back to my house. The confrontation I'd been preparing for over 8 months had lasted less than 3 hours from first observation to arrest. All that documentation, all that careful preparation, it had worked exactly as intended. Not because I wanted to hurt anyone. Not because I enjoyed seeing someone suffer consequences. But because when you're pushed far enough by someone who won't respect basic boundaries, you have to make a choice. Submit and validate their behavior, or stand firm and let the law do what it's designed to do. I'd chosen the latter. Melissa's arraignment happened the next morning via video conference. Bail was set at $5,000. She posted it and was released with conditions: no contact with me, no approaching my property, surrender of passport, agreement to appear at all scheduled hearings. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. The district attorney called that afternoon, introducing himself and explaining his prosecution strategy. He'd reviewed all the evidence files, interviewed the arresting officers, examined Melissa's statement. His assessment: this was an extremely strong case. Clear intent. Clear criminal action. Clear documentation. Melissa's position as HOA president actually worked against her because it established motive for the trespass. He expected her attorney would push for a plea deal. I asked what that might look like. He said, probably 6 months supervised probation, community service, restitution for my security upgrades and legal fees, and a permanent restraining order. Possibly a suspended sentence if her record was otherwise clean. I said that sounded reasonable. I wasn't interested in destroying her life, just in establishing that she couldn't destroy mine. He appreciated that perspective. The preliminary hearing happened exactly as scheduled 3 weeks later. I sat in the courtroom, gave my testimony, answered questions from the prosecutor and the defense attorney. The defense tried to establish I'd somehow entrapped her. I explained calmly that installing security on your own property isn't entrapment, and choosing not to assist someone committing crimes against you isn't illegal detention. 20 minutes later, I was dismissed. Melissa accepted a plea agreement that afternoon. 6 months supervised probation. 100 hours community service. 2. $500 restitution for my security upgrades and legal fees. A 2-year restraining order prohibiting any contact or approach. No jail time. No felony conviction. But a permanent record of criminal trespass and criminal mischief. That evening, the new HOA board held an emergency meeting. 40 of the 45 members attended. Melissa didn't. The vote to remove her from the presidency wasn't even close. 39 in favor, 0 opposed, 1 abstention. But the vote was just the beginning. Person after person stood up to share their own experiences with Melissa's overreach. A man who'd been fined repeatedly for violations that predated HOA color restrictions. A woman threatened with liens over garden decorations. A couple publicly criticized for parking an RV in their own driveway for 3 days. Story after story. People who had stayed silent because they didn't want conflict or didn't know they had legal grounds to push back. Now, with Melissa's authority stripped and her judgment publicly called into question by her own criminal behavior, they felt safe speaking up. The new board instituted reforms. They established a committee to review all HOA rules and enforcement procedures, ensuring everything aligned with actual legal authority and reasonable community standards. They implemented an appeals process for violations. They voted to require that any enforcement action include specific citation of the rule being violated and the legal basis for HOA jurisdiction. Basic accountability measures that should have been in place from the start but weren't, because the previous leadership had operated on an assumption of unchecked authority. Then came the vote on a formal apology to me for the harassment I'd endured, along with written acknowledgement that my property fell outside HOA jurisdiction and would never be subject to their rules. The vote was unanimous. The letter arrived a week later, professionally printed on HOA letterhead. Signed by all current board members. It acknowledged that enforcement actions against my property had been inappropriate and legally unfounded. It confirmed my land status outside HOA jurisdiction. It expressed regret for the conflict and hoped we could move forward with mutual respect. I read it twice, then filed it with all my other documentation. The community felt different after that. Lighter somehow. Like pressure had been released from a system that had been running too hot for too long. I received occasional incident reports, a vandalized mailbox, garbage left at my driveway, but nothing serious. And nothing I couldn't document and file reports on. The new HOA president, a retired accountant named David Chen, stopped by for coffee. We talked for an hour about reasonable governance, clear communication, and the importance of staying within legal authority. He acknowledged that the previous administration had troubled many people for years, but they'd never felt empowered to challenge it. I believed him. Spring came early that year, snow melting by mid-March. I spent my first afternoon in the storage shed since the arrest, finally ready to reclaim the space from its brief identity as a crime scene. The interior looked exactly as I'd left it, shelves lined with seed storage containers and gardening equipment. Everything organized and dust-free. No evidence remained except the upgraded electronic lock on the inner door. I spent the afternoon sorting heritage seeds and planning next season's garden. The work was meditative, requiring attention but not intense focus, leaving my mind free to wander. I thought about boundaries, how they protect not just property but personal autonomy. How some people spend their whole lives pushing against boundaries, testing to see what they can get away with, never quite understanding that limits exist for reasons. Property lines, legal jurisdiction, personal autonomy. These aren't suggestions. They're foundations of civil society. And when someone repeatedly violates those foundations, sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let them face the full weight of what they've done, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, because some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Melissa eventually moved to a different state. I heard through the community grapevine that she was trying to start over somewhere new, far away from the professional and social consequences of her actions. Part of me felt sympathy for that. Mistakes should have consequences. But consequences shouldn't be permanent exile. If she'd learned from this experience, if she genuinely understood where she went wrong, then relocation was probably the right choice for everyone involved. I never saw her again after that night in the snow. The restraining order remained in effect, untested and unnecessary. She'd learned her lesson. My security system stayed active, old habits and all, but the cameras mostly recorded empty property, birdsong, and the peaceful progression of seasons. Sometimes late at night, standing on my back porch looking out at my land, I'd remember that December evening, the storm, the trapped woman, the moment when I chose to let the system do what it was designed to do rather than solve the problem myself. Not with violence or anger, but with evidence, procedure, and patient application of law. It had worked. Boundaries matter. Property rights matter. And defending them when done through proper channels with proper documentation isn't aggression. It's self-respect. The lesson, if you want to call it that, isn't about defeating adversaries. It's about understanding that some people will test your limits until you make them face the consequences of crossing them. When that day comes, preparation matters more than emotion. Be thorough. Be patient. Document everything. And trust that systems designed to protect autonomy will do their job if you give them the proper evidence to work with. That's the real power, not in confrontation, but in preparation. Not in winning, but in standing firm and letting the truth backed by evidence and law speak for itself. 3 years later, I received a letter with a foreign postmark. Inside was a handwritten note from Melissa. She'd found peace, she wrote, in accepting responsibility for her actions. The probation had ended. The restraining order had expired. She'd rebuilt her life in another state, taken a job in property management working, she said, with what might have been irony, to ensure proper boundary maintenance. She asked for forgiveness. I never replied. Forgiveness wasn't mine to give or withhold. I'd simply enforced my boundaries and let the system do what it was designed to do. She'd learned the lesson through consequences, not through my mercy. And that, ultimately, was enough.